or get on the floor and stretch while you listen. You won't miss any visuals. This presentation is about another kind of experience. Please just come back to the screen for the discussion session. So again, my talk is called Softwear, How Textual Haptics Will Shape the Future of Storytelling. And the spelling of software, W-E-A-R, is not a typo. I'll explain that soon. But first, a methodology warning. 2 unconventional things are going to happen today. Heads up, I'm going to employ a methodology that derives from my current disciplinary context, which is fashion. That methodology doesn't come from academia, it comes from industry, and it's called trend spotting, sometimes trend forecasting, sometimes market research. I like the word trend spotting, which was coined by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker in the 90s to talk about sneaker culture, because it sounds cool, and also it has a literary history in William Gibson. I considered calling my methodology neuroromancing for this talk, but alas, it was the less interdisciplinary option, and it also implies Title IX violations. Trend spotting is central to a discipline whose object of study is always concerned with moving into the future at a faster than typical pace. In literary contexts, we talk about the past a lot, the present a little, and the future almost not at all. But the industry practice of fashion is obsessed with the future, which is to say, it is obsessed with the question of where form is going, which we in fashion approach as a question that experts don't have the answer to, and which we look out into the world to ordinary people to provide. I learned that technique when I worked in a marketing department, so I want to warn you that I'm about to do a thing that is unfamiliar in humanist circles, but normal elsewhere, which is talk about the future as it is emerging and make some predictive forecasts. These forecasts are not top-down prescriptive. We'll simply see if they emerge and get in on it either sooner or later. The second kind of weird thing is that today I'm going to be less interested in employing a methodology of close, deep analysis that is a fragment of a larger project, and more interested in skating across the surface of multiple projects and pieces of projects that I have authored or co-authored to try to suture them together. I'm between projects right now, so this part is a reflection of where I was when Andy asked if I could do this talk. The best terminology for the methodology that I want to employ is thought experiment. I always love that term when I encountered it in essays, though it usually only happens for a couple of paragraphs, and today it's going to be the whole thing. Please hear this presentation as less of an effort to present a body of empirical evidence of a position in order to persuade you that it is true than as an experimental proposition. I've gathered bits and pieces of things I've thought about and that others have thought about, like an acquisitive magpie, hoping to accumulate mutually resonant thoughts and ideas in sufficient volume and deliver them with enough velocity for it to feel like there's potential there. That, I believe, is how we will have enough momentum to move into the future, or a future, at least for a moment. Let's start with an F word, fashion. F word is sometimes employed by researchers and scholars to evoke attitudes toward fashion as an object of study in intellectual circles. I first heard this term at a faculty meeting here at Columbia, and it really resonated for me. I got my PhD and then tenure as an English professor, worked for 5 years in a marketing department, and came to fashion studies later in my career. I always knew that fashion was an F word, which was maybe why I was drawn to it. I wanted to call out that because fashion is historically a queer femme space, it's often denigrated as fluffy and frivolous and a bit of a source of embarrassment. Though Valerie Steele has argued that this is no longer the case as fashion studies gain stature as a discipline, I continue to see examples of it all the time, and I like to call them out when they happen and teach our queer femme and unconventionally masculine students to do that too. So to come into the STS world of hard things, books, and introduce soft things, fabric, into the textual framework also introduces fashion into a space where it is dissonant. That is intentional. I could use a different word from fashion, like apparel or textiles, but I prefer the F word, and I always make sure to say fashion instead of a synonym. It holds mythical resonance. It conjures an overarching femme queer point of view, and it represents the entire ecosystem of things that I'll call software, which includes a range of ornamental and utilitarian objects like clothes and accessories and textiles, and also things like quilts and tapestries and rugs, as well as domestic materials like baby blankets or dish towels, and also non-Western wearables like saris and keftan and so forth, and also stuff like paper, jewelry, cosmetics. I'm also including things that look and feel hard, but work like things that look and feel soft, like robots and televisions and kitchen tables. One category of things I'm not talking about today are the accessories called wearable tech, Fitbits, Google Glasses, that kind of thing. I'd categorize these as hardware, software, WARE conglomerates, and this talk is about a different technomateriality. We're also moving, when we're in the world of fashion and the software that comprises it, away from the dominance of sight and the visual rhetorics that respond to sight, and into the realm of skin and touch, a major interface area of software, though not one that fashion itself has sufficiently acknowledged or explored. I first started writing about the role of touch, or more specifically haptics, which is usually about hand interfaces, in a 2016 essay on Chris Ware's Building Stories, in a book called Emerging Genres and New Media Environments that was edited by Carolyn Miller. Ware's big book, In a Box, demanded an account of the role haptics, holding something in the hand, works. Since I wrote the first draft of that essay in 2013, when digital books were becoming a big part of the cultural conversation about texts, and I was working in a marketing department adjacent to a major design school at the time, I looked to marketing research and design practices for guidance about how they could inform a reading of the way touch might be functioning in Ware's book. And I started to wonder why touch wasn't informing more critical accounts of text in textual studies and literature generally. At first, I was thinking, guided by marketing literature, about how a designer of products and packaging could influence perceptions of quality by affecting weight and heft, because consumers associate these with quality. We often think light things aren't high quality because it seems cheap. And marketers often want designers to incorporate heft into new products so that they would haptically convey quality. They also sometimes wanted to create packaging that required users to pick things up with a certain kind of grip, like a precision grip, which uses the thumb and fingers, because it makes objects feel heavier versus the power grip in which you're holding something with a whole hand, and so things feel lighter. I learned about this and more from Dr. Stacy Wood, Langdon Professor of Marketing at NC State, when I sat in on her fantastic consumer behavior class in 2013. And I later learned even more from Dr. Jim Bettman, Burlington Professor of Business Administration at Duke, when I sat in on his fantastic PhD seminars a total of 7 times. It wasn't always the same seminar. It seems to me that we in textual studies could be asking more questions about how readers determine quality and meaning through the weight and heft of books that they might hold in their hands. And what would change about fundamental textual assumptions of value, philosophical weight, and the capacity of what's in a text to bear meaning and carry it to readers when our capacity to employ our hands in the act of reading was no longer available or not available in the same way, because the unprecedented lightness of digital textual spaces was becoming a or the predominant modality of textual consumption. I still have that question, and I still think collaborations between consumer behavior marketing professors and textual studies scholars would yield fascinating and important research in an area we might call textual haptics. I also think this research work conducted could explain the emergence of concepts like alternative facts and fake news and academic scandals around plagiarism and fabricated data and the loss of cultural respect for concepts affiliated with gravitas, like expertise and intellectual work and science. Are these phenomena associated with the movement of media texts out of the human hand? As a species, to what extent did we evolve to require haptic interfaces to function relationally? And Having evolved culturally away from a space that we might require biologically to function as a civilization, what's next? Once fashion puts us in the realm of haptics, other areas of feasible textual study start to emerge. I can't ever help lately but think about the heft of text as a unit, since I gave away about 1,000 books that were dear to me and to the life of my mind when I moved from Durham, North Carolina to Chicago, because I decided that someone who was moving around as much as I was couldn't carry that many books around. Their material weight overwhelms me and even my emotional attachment to them, or more accurately, it overwhelmed the moving budget of the school that was hiring me. Books, like fashion, come in the form of paper and cloth when they aren't digital. And paper mass producing systems were identified as extractive and destructive long before fashion mass production systems, and especially fast fashion mass production systems, were acknowledged as such in contexts like the one I work in now. Franco Moretti's seminal work in Maps, Graphs, and Trees is the best example I know of a scholar who elected to study texts not as individual objects to read deeply and closely, but rather as mass media that can be read from a distance, usually by machines and aggregated as data. No scholars that I know of are thinking about books as material objects en masse, however. Doing so might be important, as illustrated by Columbia College Chicago's library, located at 624 South Michigan Avenue. My friend Ross told me that the weight of the books in the high rise that houses our library is causing the building to sink into the land beneath it. The word on the street, I think everybody at Columbia actually knows this, it's not just a gossip between friends. The word on the street is that since commercial building spaces in downtown Chicago are only required by code to bear the load of 300 pounds per cubic square foot, which our library books far exceed, we're discovering that the weight of library books en masse is something for the world to bear, and that the materiality of books as a mass conglomerate is something vital. I think of Jane Bennett's description of thing power in Vibrant Matter from 2009, when I think of that building, moving mass of books and the vitality and ecology of books as a massive weight-bearing unit with environmental impact would be interesting for researchers to explore. At first, I thought that this was a ridiculous thing to suggest, but then I remembered that researchers have already done the same thing regarding the gas produced by cows, so I kept this suggestion in the talk. If meat lovers aren't exempt, why we book lovers? It's a question at least worth asking. Fashion has prompted me to move farther and deeper into the realm of touch, however, and I frequently find myself immersed in the realm of the human body and the function of the skin versus the eye. The versus here is problematic because these things are so entwined in human cognitive perceptual systems. But my point is that I'm learning to prioritize more intimate forms of touch than mass book volume or haptic variations. I'm still piecing out the architect Johanni Palasma's claim in The Eyes of the Skin that touch is the original sense and that all senses stem from it, and specifically how that is true for sight. And again, I have learned amazing things from consumer behavior researchers on this topic, like how humans use sight to smell and how we can smell things not present on the basis of visual depictions of the scented objects. FYI, there is a whole rabbit hole on cookies in this research, just waiting for you to go down, though it's possible we already went down it with Proust. What I do know is that humans have elaborate sensory systems designed to collect information from and about our environments, using sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and as even more research suggests, the important role of the microbiome in cognition, even digestion and the stomach. One might wonder whether the stomach, in fact, is the geographical location of the thing we refer in the vernacular to as the sixth sense. Digital spaces that fetishize sight and sound while neglecting the others leave humans in a state of somatic impoverishment and arguably craving. When fashion, in the form of fast fashion, follows the Silicon Valley model of massive exponential growth and neglects the slow pace and domestic and planetary contexts, like the weather, to which it evolved to be tethered, It replicates the design features of digital technology. But fashion, in another sense, might guide us towards something different, into the realm of touch, with a little bit of sound, since fabric makes it, and scent, since fabric absorbs it. There is an opportunity for fashion to activate taste, which is not about edible underwear and is about, as all of this is about, the legibility and constructability of texts that communicate richly through senses besides sight and allow the inevitable look that emerges to be compellingly governed by other priorities. Now is where we really start to get into the future, but we can't leave the past behind. As Cassia St. Clair observes, cloth was the original human technology, not flint, and the tools and weapons that material implies. Technology has always been a femme space, deeply enmeshed in the F word, and the fact that even revisionist histories of technology tend to ignore developments in sewing, weaving, quilting, and embroidering is, and I love St. Clair's dry wording, quote, inherently odd. She continues, weaving likely consumed more time than any form of material production practiced by prehistoric humans, and the industry of fabric production is older than pottery or metallurgy, and perhaps even agriculture and stock breeding. Fashion's prehistory invites us to take a cue from the past as we move forward, reminding us that technology began with tools designed for things like holding, swaddling, ensconcing, enveloping, wrapping, and always in interface with, perhaps even modeled on, the original prototype of skin. And so always primarily activating the sense of touch. The term software I've been using was coined by Ivy Ross, a craft artist and jewelry designer whose work is collected by global museums, including the Smithsonian and the V&A and Cooper Hewitt. Ross became a toy designer for Mattel and product developer for fashion brands like Calvin Klein, Coach, Liz Claiborne, and a whole bunch more. She also happens to now be the chief hardware officer at Google, which, given her history, is a suggestive positionality. She's a fascinating person and designer and practitioner of what she calls design feeling. And I highly recommend the podcast interview with her in Time Sensitive that came out in 2022. I came across her work a little earlier at Milan Design Week, twice in 2018 and 2019, in collaborative installations by Ross for Google with Ready-Made Architecture and Design Studio and the International Arts and Mind Lab, which is a neuroaesthetic institute at Johns Hopkins University. The first exhibit was called Softwear and simply featured technology integrated into a super soft, comfortable house. The designers transformed a gallery into a cozy abode that looked like it could have been lived in by a chic hobbit, and let visitors try to figure out where the wired tech, which was embedded in and among non-wired wearables, textiles, furniture, and household appliance, even was. And the second exhibit, which I found even more incisive, Ross and her collaborators created household living spaces again, but this time they didn't embed any digital technology. They focused on designing a rich array of interiors, offering elaborate finishes, textures, decorative objects, architectural millwork, and then they hooked the tech up to their human visitors. It was a wristband that monitored human biofunctions as they walked through the rooms, and which visitors could receive printouts of in the form of visualizations of their pulmonary and respiratory micro experiences as they walk through the space. I thought this made a brilliant point through the mobilization of neuroaesthetics about the implicit technicity of decorative objects, whose effects might need digital technology to be seen and traced and read by human perceptual systems, but which were already being enacted without it, whether we could observe it or were aware of it or not. How can we embrace a technical and textual future that acknowledges the historical and human centrality of the skin and touch? The theorists to whom I turn on this topic are Plasma's Eyes of the Skin, also an amazing book published in 1951 that fell out of print and now has a new edition called Gestalt Therapy by Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman, and Didier Anzieu's Skin Ego. I'll focus primarily on the latter, skin ego, today. Unziu's positioning of the skin is even more primordial and foundational than in the other texts, appropriately since, as Annie DeFalco has argued, quote, touch is the first sense to develop in utero and the most important sense for newborn interaction with the world. Skin is the most important organ of communication and contact. It is through the skin that the newborn learns where she begins and ends, where the boundaries of herself are. Unziu was a mid-20th century practicing psychologist who developed a theory of the self and psyche grounded in touch, especially the skin, in a series of papers and ultimately 2 editions of a book called Skin Ego. His framing is even more radical than that sentence sounds. He actually thinks that self and skin co-evolved in an evolutionary sense. Unziu also argued that the skin is a powerful perceptive organ, as much responsible for taking in and integrating information about the environment as the brain, and he problematized dialectical distinctions between the skin and mind by noting the formation of mind functions, like having a self, through skin functions. Harkening back to newborns again, Unziu's theories were grounded in the shared materiality of the skin and brain's embryonic structure of the ectoderm. Dennis Weiss, who I'm happy to say is on this call, he's my co-author in designing the domestic posthuman. So the 2 of us discuss software through the lens of Unziu's skin ego and the importance of newborn experience to guiding adult sensibilities at length in our co-authored book, Designing the Domestic Posthuman. So I won't belabor it here beyond using it to note that a self grounded in the skin and touch that treats both as organs and modalities of exploration, perception, cognition, and meaning-making, invites the examination of this element in historical texts, opens the range of texts that opens the range of texts that have meaning to spaces that have been neglected in textual scholarship, which include fashion and domestic objects, and is suggestive of directionalities for wearable texts of the future. Fashion, that queer, femme, and often BIPOC-led developmental space, might thus have something to teach us, textual scholars, about how to do this work. I'm reminded of Spivak's notion of learning to learn from below, which is to say inviting the F word and its practitioners into the middle of technical and textual design could be pivotal for the future of technical and textual development. Actually, I want to restate that sentence by rethinking the word invite. As Jane Tompkins pointed out in her seminal essay, Indians, we're already there. Engagements with existing texts via the skin and touch offer methodologies and approaches to historians and critics that are almost completely unexplored. What we will find is that some texts lend themselves better than others to the approach. And one of the things that I want to propose to the STS is that software become among the set of design textual materials whose history and meaning we study. Centuries of wardrobes exist in archives around the world, and we have a really cool one here at Columbia called the Fashion Study Collection, should you want to check it out. These are rife with opportunity for examinations through the lens of textual meaning as it is conveyed visually, as well as through touch as a means of accessing glimpses of the embodied experiences of historical wearers. This could be a branch of a renewed audience reception approach to textual studies and could make long-gone audiences reappear in partial but numinous ways. Fashion studies and textual studies should really be getting together more. But I also want to point out that there is a design future to explore when we enter this modality and introduce the notion of design futures, called trendspotting in fashion, into the theoretical space of STS. How can we create briefs for new forms of text that engage the skin and touch in the future? These may be the form that readers not only in the present, but also in the future will be most interested in engaging with. We have to engage with this pathway. The pathway I'm describing is not completely absent in literary studies. Jonathan Goldman argued in Modernism is the Literature of Celebrity in 2011 that most of what was innovative in modernist books like Ulysses could be glimpsed visually as you flip through it, and there was no real need to read in the usual way. There was a need to flip, however, so this critic may have inadvertently charted a pathway for textual studies scholars to follow toward the hand. There is also Pierre Bayard's maddeningly titled How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read from Bloomsbury in 2010, which is both a sly joke about intellectuals who do this all the time and literature classes all over the world populated by undergraduates doing it from 12 o'clock to 1:50 on a Tuesday, but also completely serious about the fact that texts are more than what we read in the words of them, and those contexts have a plethora of ways to be accessed. Bayard did not talk about the skin and touch, but could have. I also recall a quote I found in a 1930 archival copy of Vanity Fair and used in the first article I ever published, which was called Glamour and the Fashionable Mind, in which one Robert Hitchens talked about people who would as soon read the telephone book as James Joyce's Ulysses. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think he was actually comparing Ulysses to a telephone book, which is to say that both signify similarly and perhaps share a genre when you interface haptically and visually with the two of them. If we follow this suggested pathway into the future, we might begin to bring another naughty word into the picture, which is the C word. I mean craft. This joke just hit me in a great 4-hour conversation I had with friends about art on Monday, the photographer and sculptor Ross Sawyers and the book and paper artist Mel Potter. Fashion and craft, the F word and the C word, can add a lot to textual studies and to the academy because their ingrained approaches are bubbling to the surface as part of urgent futuring questions in literature and other related disciplines. I think we have to investigate the crafting of wearable and touchable texts as a preeminent creative practice. Things designed not just to be seen with the eye, but also touched by the skin. Though I believe that the formal innovations that will derive from touch-motivated textual design will also be visually engrossing, and so will the meanings they will deliver, not only to individual readers, but also to the communities that always crop up around touch-based wearable texts, so that humans can talk privately to each other in public. Currently, fashion, craft, and disciplines like consumer behavior, which now lives in marketing departments and is just starting to make its way into the most cutting-edge design programs at leading research universities, all need to get together. The F word and C word technologies are obscene technologies that drive us in a new direction, a forbidden one, that is different from many technological futuring pathways that are highly visible and highly favored in our world. These have roots in Silicon Valley, which is always drawing conversations and design futures into its hungry belly. F word and C word technologies, in contrast, begin and are explored in homes all over the world, and I mean homes in the biggest possible sense. Still, these forms of domestic and domesticated technology aren't currently talking to psychology and science to understand how to craft texts in ways that intentionally activate fields of touch that consciously and unconsciously impact human selves and bodies. It would be exciting for textual scholars entering the realm of design futures to collaborate with consumer behavior researchers to figure out how to design fashion, textiles, and architectural interiors that intentionally explore and activate and engage the skin in on both individual and collective levels. I wonder if you are wondering, like me then, what institutional structures like literature departments would begin to look like if we did these things. Things like talk about texts we're not reading, at least not in the usual ways. It's a little freaky. It's maybe really freaky. We can probably learn to be more comfortable with it from people who interface with text via touch all the time, like people whose primary textual consumption language is Braille. But I do envision a future in which studying English involves studying fashion, both the unexpected variations that walk into a classroom with our students, and also the archives all over the world filled with garments and other things that offer a form of reading that I can tell you firsthand many kinds of students really like to read. It might involve leaving classrooms to enter other kinds of rooms, handling textiles, and looking at books with our hands. Perhaps if we call this practice Braille, it will familiar things for us a little, or at least it will tell us whom to ask for help should we start doing it. I'll confess one thing. If I keep going along this line of thinking, I start to wonder whether a new paradigm for textual study might be slowly becoming the vernacular. I used to think it was design, and a couple of people at Columbia know that I've been advocating for an exploration of a common core centered in design instead of, but also inflected by the humanities. And I still think that would be cool. I've thought for a while that design's thinking and structures might be the lingua franca of, if not humanism, post-humanism. But design is problematic. And I'll point out that when designers like Bruce Mau catalog the kinds of design that can be a catalyst for change, his massive compendium leaves out fashion design, which is, to quote Cassia St. Clair again, inherently odd. So maybe the word I'm looking for isn't a D word, but a C word. Stanford already claimed the D School brand, but I note that the C School moniker is wide open for the taking. That's all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Colby. So much to think about, but I'm going to encourage people. We're kind of we're not a huge group, so I wonder if we can. I don't mind people raising their hands and commenting or questioning. We have about 20 minutes till 3, and we'll start with Gian and then David.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Colby. I lost you on my screen. Oh, there you are. Okay. That was just so fun. I really appreciated that that dive. It was so entertaining. Thank you so much for that. So I have many thoughts, and I'm not positive that I have a question in here. I just want to hear you talk about something. So it's very exciting. I love the idea of obviously connecting literature and fashion, connecting the study of English and fashion, the study of texts with the study of touch. Like I love all this stuff. And so you have me thinking about a lot of different kinds of assignments, so that's good. So there's a trend that I want to point out and hear you talk about, and this is the trend of like TV texts that are very much about clothing and fabric, like Bridgerton and Velvet and Emily in Paris. And I recently watched The Dressmaker, and I'll just go ahead and confess that I consume these like obsessively, and I'll watch them more than once, and it's really fun for me. So I want to point out also there's always been a cottage industry in adaptations of 17th, 18th, and 19th century novels. And part of the attraction, I think, for audiences is the fabric. That's always been part of the attraction for me. And I just wonder if you could comment on like any possibilities you see in the mass production of these like stories that are really about, they are about fashion. Like Bridgerton is about the clothes, among other things. So I just wonder if I could hear you talk about it.
Yeah, thanks, Jean. That's a great and fun question. And I do think I want to call out first that Dr. Kimberly Lamb, who's here on the Zoom today, is a professor of women's studies at Duke and is, I believe, working on a project that is about the evocation of clothes and presumably fabrics in early 20th century African-American texts as part of a form of self-fashioning. So I would love, I'll just put it out there, Kim, I would love for you to give your talk at STS or consider that sometime as a kind of recontextualizing of what you do, because I think it responds in some cool ways to Jean's question. I also think of a conversation that I've had. I do a lot of, in my fashion context and also in my prior marketing context, a lot of research collaborations and conversations with external partners from industry, And one of the partners I've collaborated with for a long time is Cotton Incorporated, which is an organization because so many of Cotton's users and fans identify it through the skin and touch. And they're like really worried about the movement of shopping online because they're like, how will people find us? No one checks labels. Everyone says, I love cotton. And in a live context, they try to touch it. And in a digital context, they can't. So we've actually had lots of conversations about poetics and specifically synesthesia to try to brainstorm ways that people can experience touch digitally, so that their primary way of communicating to their customers can still exist in our digital landscapes. And so I can't help but think of that as something that may be at stake in some of these really sumptuously clothed and upholstered settings that we watch on television as a way of kind of activating our sense of touch. And I'm no expert in this, and I'll sound like a fool if I try to talk about it too deeply, but I'm utterly fascinated by research that explores the interconnectedness of the senses, like the empirical scientific research that explores that, because as it turns out, when we see things, our cognitive systems can activate these other senses in ways that we might not expect or be aware of. So that reference to the research on cookies through and how we can smell things through a picture of a cookie is the best example that I know. And I would hypothesize as a novice in this space that there's something similar at work in those TV shows you were describing.
David, then Melissa.
Hi, this is Dave. I hope this is working. Suddenly my device naturally went silly right as I was about to speak, but if I get some indication, am I being heard?
You're good, David. We hear you and see your box.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad my box is representing me well. So what a fun, a great talk. I mean, just lit up on a lot of topics for me. I was reminded immediately of going 20 years back in interaction design. The initial assignment I would give students was to take home a book and to spend time holding a book and to come back and report how it was a haptic interface. I mean, so you started talking, I was like, that's it, this is great. I'm also, on the other end of your conversation, I have so many questions and look forward to talking about them, but the premise of craft as a lens, an alternative lens perhaps to the design thinking lens that everyone's very excited about in different areas. I wonder if you can speak to what degree you think that lens may be just fundamentally less industrial and fundamentally more, I mean, you may have already been saying exactly this, but if in fact the spectrum or the polarity there seems to be some kind of, for lack of a better word, capitalist or industrial edge on one side with design thinking and a market sensibility, and craft is domestically centered, what do you think the opportunities and or deficits might be when replacing or considering craft thinking, for lack of a better word, as an alternative to design thinking? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, you've just gone like right to the heart of the matter in the juggler, but in a kind way.
Oh, well, good.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question. This is a hard one for me. I'm just going to be frank about it. Because yes, I am opposing craft and industrial design. At the same time, I'm hyper aware that conversations about craft and often sustainability in fashion, a context where I'm often talking about this, that offer a kind of like anti-industrial, anti-capitalist, more sustainable pathway are deeply rooted in luxury traditions that are kind of problematic for in the expense that they pose to a consumer. So they're like bespoke luxury craft items, or like often like bespoke luxury items that we end up talking about. And I really find that problematic. Like if you're ever in a discussion with me about sustainable fashion that verges in that direction, and it always does, I'm always the person in the room who's like making a defense of mass production and the capacities of industrial design for mass production, because it's how most people access the things. So this is not a problem that I can solve like right now and today. Though in the space of fashion, I have a lot of ideas, and Dennis and I write about some of them in our book about how those two polarities can potentially be reconciled. I think in fashion, talking with companies, and we do this when we're working with companies in our program, talking with companies about how they can think about growth, not by producing like tons and tons of the exact same, or of different things for the exact same consumer, that ultimately is too much and ends up in a landfill, and thinking about growth in terms of the many, many, many consumers all over the world who don't have what they need, either because the sizes don't work, or because it's not accessible enough for the bodies that they have, et cetera, can be a means of reconciling that polarity. So I appreciate the question. I find it a really hard question. It's a question that I'm also very engaged with and curious about, and I think it is actually the question to figure out in this realm.
Thanks. That was great. And yeah, no, I didn't expect an answer, but I appreciate the thoughts. Thank you.
Melissa, then John. You're still muted, Melissa.
Still muted. Are you, Mel? I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I was talking about how great that talk was, and
Oh, thanks. Well, I
just-
want to hear that.
yeah, well, and just how many interdisciplinary points there are here. They're just a kind of, I mean, you threw out probably 10 different relational conversations that could take place. I mean, I'm really struck by the futures conversation, partly as a, as a feminist position. I am really interested in how that relates to the Indigenous conversation happening here in Chicago with the Center for Indigenous Futures, and the ways that BIPOC and Alana communities are embracing future as a concept. That's totally great. I'm wondering if you know Amy Elkins' Weaver's Handshake, because she echoes a lot of these incredible ideas. She just published a book on literary postmodern, and it I think you too would have so much to talk about. But I teach her in my craft class. But she did this beautiful video called Weaver's Handshake, and her argument echoes some of the things you put out about the ways in which touch is the community and the connection, but it also incites all of these different synesthetic relational conversations. So that just, yum. So my question, embedded in like lots of notes and thinking you're just such an intelligent, amazing person. Have you looked at all at wearable books, and where does that conversation come into play? Because that's a big conversation in religious and ethnographic communities.
Oh, man, thank you so much for that. I almost want to just write that down and not say anything, but that seems rude. So, no, I thought a lot about wearable books, and I never thought about religious artifacts in Indigenous communities as existing examples of them. And I really appreciate that that point of reference. It gives me a lot to think about. I will say I think of fashion as wearable books. So I feel like we already have lots of them. And in the talk, I was really torn between wanting to focus on the things of the past that we could bring into the present and recontextualize as not just touchable but wearable books, but also how to think about the future of them. But I do think that gosh, I'm trying to remember the author of Lotek, Lotek. Can anybody help me? You know that text? It's a design text. I thought you or Kevin might know it. I'll remember it soon. But if you Google Lotek, oh, thank you, Watson from Rich Rice. I appreciate that. She basically looks at all of these amazing examples from indigenous communities all over the world and shows the technical problems, the hard technical problems that they've already solved. Julia Watson from Dennis. Thanks, Dennis, so much. Yeah, so I think there actually are some examples of designers who are starting to turn to indigenous examples that have been practiced for a really, really long time as ways for more of us to think about stepping into the future.
Thanks. John Young, our current STS president, and then Sebastian. John?
There he is. I see him.
Thank you so much, Colby. That was so fascinating. Thank you, Andy, for setting this topic. Coming back to the really interesting book by Jhumpa Lahiri on book covers called that I happened to find while you were talking, and I was just really interested in your thoughts on, sort of haptics and materiality in relation to a part of books that is that obviously can be detached from the book, and often is. I couldn't find it while you were talking, but since you mentioned Ulysses, I have a copy where they stripped off in the 1930s when it was still banned, books as material objects and covers in particular in relation to fashion.
Oh, wow. So I really appreciate that reference and those comments. I really want to take a look at that book. This is kind of a thing that I've written about before, but it's really been a long time, so I don't remember it that well. But a piece that I thought about going back to for this talk. I think I was actually writing about H.G. Wells and recontextualizing The Island of Dr. Moreau as a book about the materiality, about clothes and about sewing and textual design. And I talked a lot in that context about, maybe one of you textual scholars can help me. I was trying to remember the really long, cool name of the practice of covering medical books in human skin. It's like, do you remember somebody that Mel might know that? Anyway, there's this word. It's a great word. I'll remember it later. That is a context that I've looked at this before as kind of making the connection between the human skin of a reader and the kinds of skins that books are. That's a really kind of like fragmented and not great response to a really good point and observation, and a thing that I really want to think about. Yeah, thank you. You guys are amazing. Anthropodermic bibliopeggy, the practice of covering medical textbooks in the 19th century in famous surgeon's own skin. So not quite close, but maybe akin to what you were describing. Thank you.
Sebastian.
Colby, what a wonderful talk. I loved hearing what you had to say, and it brought many questions for me. I'm going to try to, I have a couple of very, very simple thoughts that are going through my head right now. One is that, as humanity is progressing and we're becoming more cerebral and, with our collective fear of artificial intelligence, feeling that pressure to outsmart robots, I feel there's more and more at least for myself personally, a pressure to become more internalized And just as an example, the haptic feedback on my iPhone and the haptic feedback on my computer, I'll all turn it off because I find them distractions. And even though I'm fascinated by what you just said about, and I see the creative possibilities of combining the haptics, the technology, etc., with these kinds of things, I'm just wondering how this is going to develop in the future. And haptics as a concept is never going to disappear. We're humans after all, and there will be times where either because of a brownout or blackout or whatever, we will be forced to go back to more or earlier forms of haptic feedback. I'm a musician, as you know. One of the ways that I always learned my repertoire was by giving myself certain impulses, because it has to exist in my brain before I can actually execute it. So yeah, I don't know if this makes sense what I'm saying right now, but I'd like to hear your feedback on this.
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian. So for others on the Zoom who don't know Sebastian, Sebastian is a musician and composer here at Columbia. And I was actually thinking about, I was wondering if you would come and actually if you would talk about the role of the skin and touch in the production of music composition and performance. Because the best example that I always think of is the it's been a long time since I've played any music. I was like a little kid, but I remember vaguely the experience of thinking I couldn't remember something, and then somehow my hands would remember how to do it. I also think often of like how dangerous it is right before you're going to try to get money out of your ATM machine to think about what is your ATM code, because you might screw it up. Like your fingers remember the code, but your brain doesn't remember it so well. So I think there's a lot for music and musicians to teach us about what does it mean for touch to exist as a cognitive space, and for like ideas and whole things to be like contained in portions of the skin in some ways that we don't perceive consciously with the mind. Like I think music is ground zero of that conversation, and to me that's a really important technical dialogue and charts out a really important technical future that I don't see being talked about in technology futures circles. So I'm not anti-technology. I do have questions about digital technology. That's something Dennis and I engage quite a bit. And we both kind of wonder, well, what if these other forms of technicity and technomaterialities were more prominent parts of the cultural conversation about where we're going, technologically speaking,
Right.
and human evolution speaking.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments.
Kevin, then Kimberly, and we'll wrap up after that. Kevin Henry, did you have a comment?
Sorry. Yeah, Colby, great. I really enjoyed this. I look forward to reading it. The magical thing about writing is that it creates this sort of cerebral space of possibility that I think one has to always go back and reread. And so it's lovely the way you spun a very complex web of ideas together into a story. The thing I wanted to ask you about was, I mean, as an industrial designer, haptics have always played a big role in how we design things, with the intentionality that people are going to touch them, manipulate them, in order to operate them. And I guess with the onslaught of particularly smartphones and what I'd call the flattening of the sensorium, it's now, we're restricted to a sheet of glass. that has all this multimodality. You know, we can activate videos, we can, you know, interact with games, we can read text. And comparing that to the sensors that are built into those phones, into smartwatches, into any sort of haptic objects, I see this sort of flattening. I'm old, so I have a rich sensorium, having done lots of different things. But for young people, I see a sort of flattening of that. And it makes me concerned for a couple of reasons. Ultimately, a lot of these sensors, I mean, you made reference to types of grasp. So there's a taxonomy for everything, including how we, you know, physically grab things. I think there's maybe a dozen different types of hand positions for grabbing stuff. So as we look at this, you know, the sort of interface, the haptic interface on digital devices that are all sensor driven by motors, those motors are essentially defined by a finite set of inputs and outputs, what they can do and what they can't do, versus you know, people who talk, people who speak. There's all this, you know, sort of space of possibility, including ambiguity, and a lot of it is ambiguity. But I just wonder, have you thought about, you know, what's happening in the sort of flattening of the sensorium, particularly for younger people, and the impacts that it's going to have on both storytelling, the richness of storytelling, and also sort of the bigness of storytelling? Sorry, rambling comment and question.
No, that wasn't rambling at all. And that's actually a thing I feel very engaged, a question I feel very engaged with. I used to follow a robotics professor at the University of London, whose name I can't recall right now, but who I encountered at a conference called Future Fest in London like 10 years ago. And his lab was exploring ways to bring scent and taste into and touch into the digital realm. So he was designing things like a plugin for your phone that would emit like smells. So like if you were going to check out a perfume, if you had this, it was a piece of hardware. You could plug it into your phone and it would emit the scent so you could smell it. And things like a ring that you could wear. And if your person who was far away from you wanted to give you a hug, they could make the ring squeeze your finger. He also had like full body hug things that would squeeze your body, like a proper hug. And like a bazillion other things. And I do think it's interesting. A couple things are interesting about that. That was like 10 years ago, and I saw his prototypes. That suggests to me that as a culture, we're not really interested in bringing those senses more into our flattened out worlds. And I can think of many reasons why that might be the case, because I think those neglected senses we really associate with our creaturely animal selves, and the virtual oriented post-humans that we might want to become might want to discard those pieces of us. That'd be one account of it. And I tend to, that's why I tend, Dennis, my co-author, we tend to categorize robotics as software, WEAR. Because and clunky kinds of technologies and machines like the TV in your living room as opposed to the one on your smartphone as forms of software, even though they're not like clothes or textiles, because we're noting that users are responding to them, in some cases discarding them and neglecting them in ways similar to these other kinds of soft things and the senses affiliated with them. So I do think you're spot on in your observation. And I think at one point in my talk, well, like a question I'm obsessed with is like, what happens when we don't have 3 of our 5 or 6, depending on if you count the stomach, which I do. And what is it? What is not so much what is lost, or sorry, what is gained in a future that's like speeding forward, but what is lost that's, I don't mean this to be elegiac. I just mean it very practically speaking. Like, what don't we have more that's not as good as what we have when we have those things? And actually, there exist in the world discourses and engineers of technology that are pursuing those into the future. Why not think about and pursue them more? So yeah, I agree. This is something that Dave Girding at Columbia works on quite a bit, and we've often talked about directionalities that embrace like gadgets and things in the technical design space versus software like code-based things. So thanks for that observation.
As you gestured, you activated the light, by the way.
Oh, and I'm so glad. I've been trying to move enough. Sometimes it comes on with little movements and sometimes not so much.
For our final comment by Kimberly, I just wanted to draw attention to 3 chat items. Jacob mentions the Chicago company Canvas that makes haptic touchscreens, and David also mentions this binary of design in Silicon Valley that is very problematic. And then Nicole points us to some fascinating kind of toxic, poisonous books from the Victorian age that might add some interesting thoughts to discussion. So, Kimberly.
Hi, Colby. Thanks for this great talk and inviting me. I'm so glad to hear about your work. I guess I know you're not arguing for not reading because there's no way that you could have written that beautiful talk without reading a lot of different things in multiple ways. But you know, I've heard about that book of, you know, how to talk about a book you haven't read. I need to read it, but I guess it kind of just sets, you know, sets off alarm bells for me, you know, with the challenges of teaching students, and also, of course, like misinformation and disinformation and all the different ways that's having an impact on so many things. So, but what I saw potentially in your talk was, particularly as you move to Anzieu and the skin ego and that kind of early developmental stage that he's putting forth in relationship to touch, and touch as kind of the first sense. Do you think that holding books as haptic objects and having that kind of, you know, getting in touch with that feeling of touch is, which is a kind of going back, obviously, or could be understood that way. Could that lead to a kind of you know, a future of reading that wasn't flat, that had a kind of depth, that that would kind of help to instill the haptic experience as one of reading as one of value.
Thank you
Does
for
that
that.
make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, Kim. And I'm really happy that you asked this question, because I don't see my talk as being a call for less reading or an abandonment of reading. I really see it as a call for more reading. And in one way, by expanding the realm of what reading means and what we might read. That's certainly there, and it could go in a direction where it's not books, where it's never books, possibly. And then that begs the question of, is that bad? Is so long as you're reading something, is that okay? I would point to the fact that novels and television have been talked about in critical circles in kind of similar ways at their at the points of their birth, that is denigratingly is damaging to human consciousness and experience in life. And so I do feel personally, I do feel like, obviously I love to read. I read all the time. I'm kind of an obsessive reader, but I also do feel open to the idea more now than I used to be, very honestly, to the idea that reading, that what we read hungrily, prolifically, could be different kinds of texts, and that could be okay. I do think there's something about the act of reading that's important for humans, but what we read and what that may be in turning into in the future, I feel kind of okay about exploring a wide variety of those things. On the other hand, I love how the sort of direction that your talk went, because I do think that exploring haptic interfaces could lead individuals who don't like to read books now to like to read books. And I'm actually conducting something of an experiment, a very informal experiment. I'm glad my colleague from NC State in consumer behavior is no longer here. It's a very informal, you wouldn't count it as an experiment, but I count it as an experiment. And it's with my nephew, who I buy books, I only buy books for. He's 16. I only buy books for him for his birthday and Christmas. And he doesn't like to read. He doesn't read any of them, but I keep sending them. And my niece as well, and they like showing their bookshelves to people. Neither has yet to read a book that I've picked for them, and I've tried all the genres, and sort of thought eventually, I've always been of the mind, you know, you do, so long as you find the right one, but I haven't found it yet. But I will say that I've started a new experiment, because I thought, well, maybe the form of the book just isn't right for this guy. Maybe it's not the genre, maybe it's not the content, maybe it's about the form. And I thought, maybe if I do these things like text him and say, Gus, send me 5 words that best describe your Gusness, and he sends them to me, and I write him a story that's, 2 pages long, and I type it out. I'm not going to do it on a typewriter. I'm going to do it on the computer. I'm going to print it out, and I print it, and I put it in an envelope, and I mail it to him, and that's chapter 1. I'm really curious, will he do that? And he could be the determiner, but does he get chapter 2? Does he get chapter 3? Does he get chapter 4? Because I'm really curious about, does the fragmentation of the book into more of a serial form make him want to read the book? We don't do that so much anymore, so we wouldn't know if that's a thing he likes. And does getting the thing on paper, does the piece of paper in an envelope, specially for you, written for no one else is going to ever, God forbid, read this thing. This book's just for you, that you get in your mailbox, that your aunt wrote. That's kind of about you a little bit. Does that engage his attention? Like, I feel like there's all these things that you can draw from an experimental realm that don't really exist that much in our culture now, that are deeply embedded in the history of the book and literary practice, that are kind of fun to try out on a young reader who doesn't like to read, but does like the materiality of books in some way. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know, but maybe in a future STS, I will report.
Well, one more round of applause for Colbey and this wonderful kind of kickoff to our series. So thanks again, Colbey, for this. So much to think about. And join us next month. I will just kind of give up a preview on our Colloquium series. It's essentially the first Friday of every month, and February 7th, Dr. Amy Earhart, Associate Professor of English and Acting Director of the Center for Digital Humanities at Texas A&M, will talk about the Millikan Massacre, networked racial violence, and archival restitution. So a different direction, but so wonderful to get something new and fresh. Colbey, thank you.
Thanks. Great to see you all. I appreciate you.
Thanks everyone for coming today. Bye-bye.
Bye.